outset, I want to acknowledge that there are several different models floating around of emotional intelligence. This is mine. The first was actually proposed by my old friend Peter Salovey when he was a junior professor at Yale back in 1990. Peter now is the president of Yale University, probably because he has a lot of emotional intelligence himself, in part. Anyway, Peter published that article with a graduate student, John Mayer, in a very obscure journal. I'm not sure that journal exists anymore, but at the time, I was at the New York Times, and I was tasked with finding important new ideas that might be of interest. And I thought, wow, emotional intelligence, what a great concept. It sounds like an oxymoron, emotions don't go with intelligence. But then I realized it's really being intelligent about emotions. And so I wrote my 1995 book, Emotional Intelligence, and brought in a lot of other data that I've been tracking that had to do with emotions in the brain and why kids need to learn this, and one little chapter on managing with heart, how this mattered for business. And to my astonishment, that chapter got a huge amount of interest, which led me to look at the implications for the work life. And my original model had five parts. Motivation was a fifth, but we folded that into self-management. And a recent meta-analysis actually has shown that this particular model, especially as measured by the emotional and social competence inventory, which looks at behavioral signs of each of these 12 competencies, that actually is the best predictor of workplace performance. In fact, Wired magazine a couple months ago had an article called "Emotional Intelligence is the New Black." In other words, you've got to have it in your wardrobe, so to speak. And the folks at Davos, the World Economic Forum, list emotional intelligence as one of the 10 essentials for the future. Another interesting thing I just saw, there was a study of engineers who were asked to rate other engineers they worked with in terms of their success as engineers. And it turned out IQ correlated zero with how engineers saw you, other engineers saw you, and emotional intelligence correlated very highly. And this has to do with the paradoxical relationship between IQ and emotional intelligence. I feel you need them both, but IQ is largely a threshold ability. For example, some folks I know at Egon Zehnder International, which is recruits executives, C-level executives. They looked at people that they have recommended for C-level positions who were hired but were later fired, and they wondered what went wrong. And what they realized was that they had been hired for their business expertise or cognitive abilities, but they were invariably fired for a lapse in emotional intelligence and some aspect of it. And as you see in this model, there are many different ways you can be emotionally intelligent. You can have strengths in some competencies and be limited in others. So it's like IQ where you have a single score, but rather how you do in each of the various ways that emotional intelligence can be expressed in high performance in the workplace. I went back to my mentor at Harvard's research, David McClellan, when I started to think about how emotional intelligence mattered for leadership, teamwork, in the workplace. And he had proposed what became the basis for competence modeling. He was one of the early people in that field. And most companies, at least large world-class companies, have competence models, particularly for leadership positions. And what you see here is the distillation I was able to come up with of competencies. This is kind of a generic competence model. And the interesting thing is that IQ is largely a threshold ability in kind of a back of the envelope analysis that I did years ago for the book Working with Emotional Intelligence. It turned out that cognitive skills, IQ, was not as important as emotional intelligence when it came to the competencies the distinguished star performers. Those are the ones that are reflected in this model here. Uh, IQ and cognitive skills, technical abilities are largely threshold. They get you in the game, but they don't predict how well you do as a team member or as a leader. That's where the emotional intelligence competencies come in. When I looked at competence models for C-level positions, for top leaders, 80 to 90% of the competencies the organizations themselves had determined set the best apart from the average were based on emotional intelligence. So I think even though companies worldwide know this, every generation needs to learn this anew. And you may have seen this in people that you work with. A recent study showed that if you ask top executives, really seasoned leaders, do these soft skills, does emotional intelligence really matter for performance? About 90% say yes. But if you ask new hires, you get a very different response. About 70% say, oh no, technical skills are much more important. And I think that's a bias that people need to unlearn as they see what really matters as they operate in the workplace.